Merci Michel pour l'invitation d'être ici. Je suis heureux d'être ici encore à l'Université de Montréal. C'est sur le territoire traditionnel des Mohawks, je crois, et les Abenakis. I'm going to spend, I had a very ambitious abstract, reading it last week to prepare. And so what I've come up with in trying to cover the terrain that I proposed to cover will take about 40 minutes, I'm hoping, which would hopefully leave us time for questions after, plus or minus, I guess. But what I'm going to present are some ideas that I have brought together through my teaching in health studies and health promotion, more specifically, with some of the research that Kate was referring to that, for the most part, has been taking place out on the West Coast in Vancouver for the past number of years. And in bringing these things together, what I'm going to try to do is to be a little bit provocative about the stuff that we call public health. And I want to generate discussion about how we might enable ourselves to find ways to understand the box that we're in when we define ourselves as people who do public health research, and then find ways to get outside of that box. And particularly in public health and health promotion practice focused on environmental health. One caveat that is that my research and my primary concern within this field is around environmental health inequities, which is the name of the chair in the center. And so I'm interested in how we attend to this idea of inequity and how do we understand inequity and how do we address inequities through research. I've spent a number of years calling myself a geographer, teaching courses to students within that discipline. And so what I want to do in this talk is to import some of the hard lessons that have been learned through the century and a half or so that geography has existed as a formal discipline, and to try to import some of those lessons into what we now might refer to as the discipline of the new public health that has emerged that has the same lineage, but has really kind of established itself in the last half century, the most recent half century. I'll try to, there we go. And as, again, Kate referred in the abstract or in my biography, it's important to acknowledge my own intellectual allegiance within public health more broadly that's rooted very firmly within a particular strand of the field's genealogy of the last 30 years, which is to see our purpose in what we might call a very normative academic discipline. That is, on one part, a discipline of academic inquiry and also professional practice that's very much interested not only in understanding the world, but intervening in the world, and intervening in order to improve population health and specifically to promote health equity. So as a normative discipline, many have called for, over the years, for us to be a social movement for health, including Dennis Raphael and his colleagues in this 2008 paper, or at least supporting a social movement for health as the most effective way to advance a public health agenda, specifically one that aims to prioritize health inequities as one of its primary raison d'etre. But what my talk today is concerned about is what is required for us. Like, what does it take for us to be a part of a social movement as researchers? More specifically, in the current discourse that we all abide by, the social determinants of health, how does this language of determinant, one determines the other, jive or not jive with the language of a movement? And so the cautionary note that I'm going to offer is one that provokes a more theoretically astute account of what the social is and how it ostensibly determines our health. And what I'll end up with is a call for a more relational epistemology of health that moves us away from deterministic language and perhaps more practically calls for more rather than less, as has been the case for the past number of years, less acceptance of social scientific approaches, specifically theoretical approaches within normative public health practice, which has tended in these last years and decades to start to lean more heavily on epistemologies borrowed from medicine, including the notion of evidence-based decision-making. So we'll go back in time to start. It was Hippocrates who inspired the idea that there was something that determines our health other than the whim of the gods. And it turns out that this something has everything to do with geography. The Hippocratic tradition recognized that health varied among the people, and this variation was determined by differences in people's physiology, behavior, and, shall we say, their capacities, which in turn are determined by geographical variations in environmental conditions from region to region throughout Athenian Greece and its surrounding regions. Hippocrates' practice as a medical geographer was located firmly within the often very messy everyday lives of his patients. He was an astute observer of not only their bodily symptoms, but of the conditions of their homes, their communities, and their wider environments. One might even say that his treatise, one of his treatises on airs, waters, and places, was a first commission on the social determinants of health, recognizing that physicians conduct their practice in the world by first and foremost understanding that world and their patient's social and physical location within it. In many ways, Hippocratic medicine was an archetype of modern public health, and in a way, he was not unlike another founder of the discipline of public health, some 2,000-something years later. John Snow's infamous intervention on Broad Street epitomized the rising influence of the British sanitary reform movement, stressing that term, which would of course go on to mark the long-standing axiom in modern public health, that is, this idea that where there is poverty or poor people, there tends to be lousy environments, and therefore terrible diseases result. And we ought to do something about those diseases. Many modern comparisons and even lessons might be made of the first social movement of health for health over a century and a half ago, driven by the evidence of the likes of Snow and Edwin Chadwick, but also inspired by the dramatic representations of the conditions of the lower class by Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell, Charles Kingsley. It was firmly a class-based movement, motivated by and within England's aristocracy to act, in part out of a perceived benevolence toward their fellow Britons, but probably more out of a fear of a miasma that could all too easily transcend the stable geographic separation between the rich and the poor. But there's another historical comparison that I want to draw between antiquity, the social reform movement during the Second Industrial Revolution, and our contemporary affinity today to this idea of the social determinants of health. The historical lesson I draw attention to has to do with the underlying ideology behind both the medical science of antiquity and of the Enlightenment, particularly how in both cases a determinist ideology, or more specifically environmental determinism, worked within and through science to account for human variation in ways that would justify rather than to confront and perhaps undo inequality, as is the ostensible aim of public health as we know it today. And to wit, for all of the contextual insights that Hippocratic medicine introduced over 2 millennia ago, his theory of human health and the environment was also fundamentally flawed, once it ventured into the realm of explaining the connection between nature, society, and human capacity. The original environmental determinist, Hippocrates, not only observed the links between human diseases and environmental conditions, but also proposed that the environment dictated such individual and social traits as human intelligence, courage, personality, sexuality, culture, and even capacity to govern. His was an agency-phobic approach that reflected the political hegemony of the era, deeming the barbarians to the north to be naturally and inescapably inferior to the civilized inhabitants of the Mediterranean, attributed, of course, to their more amenable climates and the concomitant quality of regional environments in Greece. And so the very etymology of barbarian is a Greek one that refers to the idea of inferiority, or perhaps environmentally vulnerable people. Jumping ahead back to John Snow's time, around the time of the sanitary reform movement, were similar ideas circulating about social class, race, and gender, all infused by what was then a widely accepted embrace of social Darwinism, a perverted transposition, here's the zoologist in me coming out, of Darwin's natural selection theory onto human society, and often legitimized through very highly influential but also highly racist scientific practices of phrenology. A perversion of this natural selection theory, or phrenology, was a central plank of a form of political rationality that gave an impetus for civilized states to dominate the rest of the world and to subjugate inferior races such that the human condition might be improved through social selection. And in the 19th century, a great deal of scientific practice, including that of the nascent discipline of geography, to blame myself or my academic ancestors, it took place within a very circumscribed European Enlightenment that took as its inspiration ideas of race and place from previous centuries' philosophers like David Hume and Immanuel Kant that were very much like that of Hippocrates, only pronounced in relation to a very European view of the world that othered everyone away from the civilized West or outside of the civilized West. And through the mantle of scientific evidence came a reemergence of the barbarian, this time under the pseudoscientific construct of race, initially as an explanatory meta-concept deduced through the crude pronouncements of people like Hume, who was, and I quote, apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all other species of men to be naturally inferior to the whites. Likewise, Kant, whose philosophy was very influential in the formation of the German tradition of geography in the century after his death, also felt, and I quote, that humanity is at its greatest perfect in the race of the whites. And so while the broken pump handle was indeed a successful intervention to put the brakes on the bacterial agent of cholera, it also happened within a broader ideology of empire that was taking hold throughout Britain. Both science and empire were justified by an environmental determinism, but that happened to leave the poor poor and the colonized world enslaved, oppressed, and often exterminated. And geographers have long been forced to reconcile themselves to an intellectual inheritance imported from European Enlightenment philosophy about the nature of knowledge and notions of human progress and civilization. And whether wittingly or not, these ideas became the very justification for imperialist monarchies to dominate new territories, resources, and populations, and even knowledge itself. And central to this justification was a need to account for the limitless human and natural diversity that Europeans encountered in their expanding territories, and then to internalize all of this into a scientific rationality, the very inconvenient moral conflicts that came when such people and places became subjugated by the empires and colonies that displaced them, or in many cases exterminated them altogether. And it was the ideas of the like of Friedrich Ratzel, who was the German geographer of the 19th century, theories and empirical substantiations of his anthropogeography, which is the predecessor of human geography as we know it today, that natural and environmentally determined stratifications of human variations in anatomy, behavior, and intellectual capacity, these ideas could be co-opted, often in very perverted ways, into a political arena, eventually paving the way for major global conflicts of the 20th century, justifying fascist ideas like Lebensraum, which was Ratzel's idea, corrupted into Nazi ideology, and similarly in Japanese Showa ultranationalism. But geographers also imported environmental determinism over here to our side of the ocean, particularly, and it was particularly easy given its alignment to the American political doctrine of manifest destiny, applied both to the westward expansion of the United States and in the 20th century to its turn to a more global outlook. In the late 19th century, geographer Ellen Churchill Semple, who was a student of Ratzel's in Germany, expounded environmental determinism as the core of the discipline of North American geography. This is in the sort of second decade of the 20th century. Her arguments were little more than a redux of Hippocrates, Kant, and Hume, but elaborated by early 20th century geographic science, deployed to impress the idea that behaviors, cultures, and institutions were a natural consequence of environmental endowments in societies around the world, or lack thereof. But such ideas in the early 20th century were nonetheless highly influential, if only by their witting uptake by governments to ensconce ideas about class and race, or ideas about racial superiority and justifiable social inequality within North American culture. Closer to our own home, such pseudoscientific ideologies run rampant through Canada's own long history of colonization and the many acts of cultural genocide that have been committed against Indigenous people. The Indian Act of 1876 was abundantly determinist in its legalization of Indigenous Canadians as an inferior group, incapable of self-determination, and thus rendered wards of the state. But to make a long story short about geography and its hard lessons, it took almost a century of messing around with this fixation on determinism, segueing after World War II into a spatial science that was bent on discovering universal laws associated with human economic and social and cultural activities, all by emulating the methods of the physical rather than the social sciences, and adhering to an underlying epistemology of positivism to the exclusion of social theory and a recognition of the importance of context and contingency. And it wasn't until the new social movements that erupted in the late 1960s and 1970s that geography took a hard turn toward the social sciences, in particular through the reascending influence of Marxist geographies led by the influential work of David Harvey, pictured here, and later through feminist and other critical theoretical perspectives developed over this most recent 40 years of the discipline. In the process, moving beyond its determinist inheritance in favor of more situated, relational, and human-centered forms of inquiry into the geography of everyday life, the geography of oppression, injustice, and inequality in all of its socio-spatial forms. So, enough about geography. It's in this overly brief genealogy of my own discipline where I find myself drawing analogies to this ostensibly new, now half a century old, public health. And we've been languishing over this for some 4 decades. And at the risk of painting another overly simplistic picture, let me trace a crude course over the main epistemological quagmire that remains at the center of public health. The schism, so to speak, between adherents of the so-called socio-ecological school that often calls itself health promotion, and the more techno-rational school that often tends to call itself population health, as though there's some firm separation between those two. But my purpose is not to beat a dead horse or to navel-gaze or to resurrect a sleeping dog, but rather to highlight a covert determinism that, in my opinion, infects both schools, both sides of the schism. And here lies the social determinants of health, perhaps the only phrase that all variants of public health researchers and practitioners can pronounce together without falling into some pitiless epistemic disagreement over theory or lack of theory, method, or relative visibility or invisibility in the currently rather austere funding environment that we all rant and rave about at CIHR. Here, the social is reduced to a bucket list of bodies, identities, classes, and phenotypes, whether gathered together in some kind of fatalist multivariate regression, or each subjected to its own tall order of policy fixes demanding more funding and or less waste so that resources can be directed to those whose deficits need our help the most. Those other people, those problematic, health-compromised others that are beyond or underneath some kind of perverse ontological cutoff from the norm, the majority, the middle class, or whatever category you want to use, perhaps even the healthy. Here lies the deeply entrenched determinism of modern public health, the separation between the Athenians and the barbarians, the Europeans and the colonies, the whites and the blacks, the civilized and the native. But if the sleeping dogs or dead horses belong to the graveyard of the previous millennium, the history of the first 15 years of the 21st century have something to teach us about the ascendance of evidence as a meta-discourse in public health that has vanquished all competing claims to the limelight of our current era. And where once upon a time, back in the 90s, scholars like Ann Peterson and Dennis Raphael and others were making very earnest and appropriate claims that health promotion ought to be a social science. Many of us can probably remember reading those papers. in essence attempting to turn public health in the same way, albeit a couple of decades later, that my mother discipline of geography turned. But this effort has been arguably abandoned or at least relegated to the margins insofar as the institutional blessings of Canada's public health system and the agencies that fund us go. The problem that we who believe in the social sciences and public health encountered probably pertains at least to some degree to the bad timing in coming about being advanced or advocated for right at the point of the rising tide of neoliberalism. The political ideology, this economic doctrine, the cultural monotheism and individualization ushered in starting in the 80s and reaching full-throated, almost evangelical prominence through the 1990s, then aging out, dying a death in 2008, only to be resurrected in the aftermath of some kind of neoliberal zombie apocalypse of permanent austerity, slow growth, social anomie, and overall lessened expectations that we find ourselves surrounded by today. So those of us who take theory seriously, who embrace methodological pluralism, who position ourselves in the world, often feel like we've somehow gotten into the business of farming pumpkins. This most curious but relatively useless of fruits, carefully tended to year after year, nurtured and grown, only to be rolled out for a day, put on display in some spectacular, glowing construction, and then quickly binned into the compost when we all return back to the real world of doing the business of public health. So let's remind ourselves of what has come, though, despite all of this, to be a truism in public health, and consider what the WHO tells us, or has been telling us for the last number of years. Inequity is difference that is unjust. So in addition to what we might consider to be a dominant frame in public health practice, which emphasizes the first half of this sentence, that is, minimizing differences between those who are healthy and those who are not, we argue that we need to focus a little bit more attention on the idea of seeking justice, or put another way, shifting our attention to finding injustices in the world and then finding ways to uproot them. But if we all hold on to this determinist epistemology, we're led into a mode of intervention that is all about us and them. We fix our gaze on the inferior, the vulnerable population. Our aim is to minimize the difference between these two. Through measurement, such differences become an ontological benchmark for a plane of normality and a pit of deprivation based on racial markers, polluted bodies, and blighted neighborhoods. Our prescriptions fix on fixing the deficits of these others, and our interventions are based on we, the heteronormative middle class. Our lifestyles, our behaviors, our eating habits, our jobs, our family responsibilities, our neighborhoods become the model through which public health constructs the city as it ought to be. We fix ourselves on fixing other people and places, not only through charitable giving, but in programs and policies that are aimed at providing resources and supports, education on how to be healthy, how to be well, able, prosperous, all according to these pre-established benchmarks. This ideology is what I encountered when I began working in the community in one of these blighted districts in Vancouver, here portrayed by the Globe and Mail as a national embarrassment in the lead up to the 2010 Olympics. Our scientific fixation on urban, social, and environmental deprivation and urban blight, which public health researchers are as guilty as the media in doing, in using place, for example, as a proxy for health. But when these get transferred into policy and in media terminology, these places become slums or gulags, according to the National Post. But what this model misses is the ability to problematize the rest of us. Those of us in this normal plane of wellness are given a free pass. We don't need to think about the potential that our lifestyle choices, our own pursuit of affluence in a rigged real estate market that epitomizes Vancouver, may somehow be related to or even causal of the subordinate conditions of others. And of course, when the rigged game comes back to bite us in the ass, us middle-class Canadians, then we very quickly find other ways of measuring, to identify other kinds of difference, to blame another other. This time in Vancouver, the Chinese foreign investor, for all of the woes of our present affordability crisis, increasingly, absolutely in crisis in Vancouver, and more so everywhere else in Canada. But there's a silver lining in the accusations of xenophobia and race baiting that have ensued in this debate, that are implied in such studies as they effectively reverse the gaze, and they put us in the inferior plane against the perceived threat, not of a vulnerable other, but of a dangerous other. And while in Vancouver there's a long and horrible history to this reversal in the threat of the Yellow Menace that saw the justification of policies of expulsion, dispossession, imprisonment, and dispersal, and I will add deportation, of an entire population of 23,000 Canadians of Japanese ancestry, now today taking the form of the Chinese foreign investor in our midst. There is also the potential, but there is also in this potential the reversal to the potential in this reversal, to recognize a different and a more relational ontology of inequity that views the gradient in environmental conditions, racialized neighbors, and health as a slippery slope rather than unequal planes. A slope made steeper for families who are deprived of one or more of the so-called social determinants of health. The gradient is made more slick by our race and class privilege, as well as by our hegemonic ideas about normal and healthy. These become the grease that's poured upon the lower class in the form of encouragements and expectations for them to work harder, to be more educated, and to take responsibility for their health. But while the model still shows some people painted red and others painted blue, at least we recognize that we are all in this together, but that through our own actions or our inactions, we figuratively and often literally continue to make them, positioned as the problematic other and assigned as such on the basis of markers of their identity, culture, or even just their phenotype. And in recognizing that this figure is a closer representation of the reality of health inequity, this prompts a change in focus for public health that requires that we move beyond fixing surface problems to transforming the way that urban inhabitants relate to each other. This means not only how we make them red, but how we make ourselves blue. So I would argue that this relational shift requires that we dispense with the mantra of the social determinants of health altogether and opt rather for a more recursive model in which health can be seen as one of many interactive influences along with other markers of social stratification, and that other elements of the social, including racism and xenophobia, and dare I say it, free market fundamentalism, individualization, and other measures of urban neoliberalism can be placed at the surface of our scrutiny, at the sharp end of our research stick. And so by focusing on the concept rather than the method, this is not a rail against any particular disciplinary method of environmental epidemiology, for example, nor is it some blanket endorsement of qualitative approaches that privilege the voice of the oppressed. Rather, it recognizes that both methods are important, but it simply offers a conceptual framework for more equity-focused research that helps us to raise different kinds of public health questions. And if you can stand one more analogy, I wish, on my most wishful of days, for an opportunity for us in our field of public health to become less like a discipline of forensic science, constantly examining the victims and the setting of the crime for the clues about their death and the immediate circumstances, and more like criminal profilers, knowing that whatever the specific cause of death, somewhere out there, elsewhere, there is a perpetrator, probably long departed from the scene of the crime. In other words, we all need to be watching less CSI and more Criminal Minds. I know we started late and it's 20 to the hour, but now this is where I will segue to research, but if people have to leave at 1, I don't want to crunch the question period?
How much time do you have?
Take a vote. I could probably get through it in maximum 10 minutes. I'll talk doubly fast. Sorry. Okay, so here's the illustrations from my own work. So I'm going to try to conclude my talk through some of the illustrations that have been developed through this community-based research partnership. And it illustrates my own journey or attempt to move away from victim-focused to perpetrator-focused research. I think one of the interesting things about this journey, and probably relevant to the discussion today, is that I've increasingly found myself letting go of health altogether. In part driven by the vagaries of Tri-Council and the disabling schism between so-called health-focused CIHR and anything but health-focused SSHRC, but more to the point, feeling more comfortable in a skin that doesn't place health at the end point of my inquiry. The backdrop to the research is this neighborhood of the downtown east side that is perhaps one of our country's most important sites of human rights struggle and achievement, but also one of our country's most blighted urban districts. It's a neighborhood that was taken from its indigenous stewards without asking, quickly left behind by its earlier occupiers, to be rebuilt by a highly racialized labor class of Japanese Canadians that was very much integral to Western Canada's resource sector, until they too were forcibly removed in 1942. The uprooting of Japanese Canadians paved the way for its evolution into the last bastion of affordable housing in the city of Vancouver, and a refuge for its social outcasts. But leaping forward to today, after decades of the willful blighting of this neighborhood, driven by an ethos of containing the urban poor, it's now, ironically, this very history, or at least a partial reading of this history, that we see the emergence of a new urban brand called Japantown being seared onto this neighborhood, which these days has the unfortunate status of being the next target of Vancouver's drive for condoization. The well-intended interveners, which includes public health, all too readily work within the logic of the creative class to impose this faux Japanese co-opted public image onto this place, ostensibly to represent this place as healthier, but really just to make it more attractive for the purchase by healthier people. So to investigate this phenomenon, to try to point to the perpetrators of this new urban dispossession, we opted to shed the mantle of health, and with it, we became freed from the problematic present and the deterministic gaze that seemed to be limiting our ability to frame our work in line with what we were observing on the ground. In its place, we sought to undertake a sort of Foucaultian history of the present in our research, shifting towards a view of how this place came to be this way, how, for instance, community is made possible even within, or perhaps because, of the constant levels of life disruption, uprooting, and of course, compromised health that are so deeply and historically rooted in this neighborhood, and how disdainful representation of this place appear to be dictating its fate in the present era. So through an arts-based exploration of human rights in place, we sought to re-narrate this neighborhood of the downtown east side. Not one that is simply therapeutic to health, but one that's rich with a social legacy of struggle, won and lost by inhabitants, past and present, over their right to remain amidst and in the face of the forces of dispossession. Then it was war and security, and now it's capital and revitalization. So with a very relational intent in mind, we've sought to work with the idea of the right to remain not only in the community, but throughout the city of Vancouver, making it relevant to all inhabitants of the city. Our research approach used arts not as a method of solicitation, but as a method of activation, a careful assembly of disparate human rights narratives, an immersive coalescing of knowledge from across time and space, and among inhabitants of the downtown east side, and human rights activists from all other lineages. For the past 3 years, rather than exporting our data into, or exporting the data from the research into our space, we followed a relational epistemology that let the data remain in the community. We implemented a year-long community fair, and I'll show some images here, This one is of the Powell Street Festival, which is the Japanese-Canadian festival that celebrates Japanese-Canadian history in the neighborhood every summer. We put our ideas of the team to work here through postcard exchanges between festival goers at the Powell Street Festival and then, this is 2014, an encampment of homeless activists who had occupied the festival site in the weeks leading up to the festival on the grounds of Oppenheimer Park. The specter of the camp to the city was, the specter of it disrupting the festival became a justification by the city for dismantling the camp. But fortunately, the organizers, who were a research partner within this project, had the political acumen to just simply move the festival out of the park and onto the adjacent street in an act of solidarity with the protesters around the chronic housing issue in that neighborhood. And so these postcard exchanges amplified the solidarity, beginning to project a different kind of Japantown than the one that was being represented by the planners. So for this year, we undertook these arts workshops throughout the community, led by a team of artist facilitators from the downtown east side and held at several very instrumental key community sites. The purpose was to identify rights and their denial, the conditions of urban life that have resulted from the denial, and to trace such denial to their roots in environmental racism and colonization. This storyboard, created by Savannah from a workshop at Aboriginal Front Door, speaks to the Indigenous dispossession that occurred during colonization and settlement, and its aim was to reinscribe the continuous history of Indigenous inhabitation that has been largely erased from public representations of this neighborhood, including the representation known as Japantown. This diorama by Tracy, constructed in a July workshop last year at the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, depicts the prevalent desire for an Aboriginal healing and wellness center in the neighborhood, and using the right to remain imagery and activist slogans to honor this long unrealized struggle for a key community resource. Here, a tableau performed at the Galerie Gachet last fall depicts the annual Women's Memorial March for missing and murdered Indigenous women, and it's miming the scene of a famous photograph that was taken of the marchers, juxtaposed in front of a public poster for a strip club. The tableau confronts the long history of sexual exploitation of Indigenous women's bodies and identities in the downtown east side, and it commemorates the resilience and bravery of the women who march and who remain in this place despite the constant encroachment of predators in their midst. And here, a workshop we held in partnership with a locally organized housing convention. The activity emulated at that convention was of creating wooden blocks called emma that are based in Shinto practice of writing wishes or prayers for the downtown east side. We used imagery and text from our archival and our interview research to narrate this history of the present, literally joining together the material and the discursive. This anonymous piece depicted here projects past onto present space, linking the atrocity of the War Measures Act of dispossession to the equally atrocious acts of dispossession committed by the slumlords, while the state continues to look the way in the face of the lack of affordable housing in the city. And it's no accident that this event took place at the venue of one of our other partners, the Vancouver Japanese Language School, which was a community anchor prior to the war, and one of only 2 Japanese-Canadian properties that were returned after the war. The Right to Remain literally took to the streets, here in the making of a banner, as a low-barrier way of accessing the project and participating in the project during the community fairs. The banner would come to herald the presence of our research in the community, connecting narratives and places and flown in solidarity with protests such as this housing march, until it reached its final place as part of the Right to Remain exhibitions. It was launched this March, beginning in a month-long installation at the Galerie Gachet in the downtown east side, and it's now presently installed at the Japanese-Canadian or Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby, and remains open until next January. The exhibition has become a space created to celebrate the human rights legacy of the community by showcasing both the processes and perspectives gained through the research. This is in the museum today. Coalescing historically disparate narratives into a more unified meta-narrative, folding together countless stories of Powell Street and the downtown East Side, from Indigenous, Japanese Canadian, and other past and present inhabitants. It has become a seamless, hybrid geography of people, places, bricks, mortar, rights, and activism. Here, through photography. Still worth 1,000 words, but this time not words given over to us, the researchers, but as a co-construction of narratives of rights infringed and rights asserted. This is in the Galerie Gachet in the spring. Finally, the exhibitions that have linked community activisms far outside of the downtown East Side, including this documentary film, which is displayed in the exhibits but also aired on CBC in the summer. So our aim here is to try to reach hundreds, if not thousands, of Vancouver students and community members with this right to remain message and to make it pertinent to everybody. So the lesson learned that placing the social in front of health comes natural to geographers who have embraced a post-positivist social science stance in our investigations of urban environmental health. But a focus on the social as superordinate to health is not in of itself a sufficient epistemological maneuver to overcome determinism. Put another way, knowledge that is appropriated from the community according to preconceived cause-effect determinism may satisfy some of our institutional requirements and certainly pleases our funders, but I question its impact on the elusive and largely disinterested policymakers that we all too often bow down to in our efforts to translate knowledge to key stakeholders, found at the end of grants and project proposals, and reflecting a theoretically sparse model of research dissemination. For knowledge that is by the community and to be put to work for the community, it must be available to those in the community who do the hard work of asserting those perspectives in their community and beyond. As a health geographer, I find that I am most convinced by my own ideas and arguments when I don't impose a health meta-narrative onto my work from the outset. I am increasingly content in doing a form of health research that does not inscribe spatial causation to all things reduced to health, but that makes a discursive political space for articulating subaltern knowledge of place, history, rights, dignity, and as part of all of that, even health, of an actually existing community that's speaking out against an otherwise deafening and damning discourse of urban and health fixation. The evangelists of an imaginary community that they all desire that always appears to be just on the horizon. I want to quickly acknowledge the research team that brought that research about over the last few years. In the slides. Oh, there was another one. Oh, there it is. This is some websites. And just to leave you with this quote, hot off the presses, Laura Polito, as a point of inspiration or perhaps just a little bit of self-indulgence. And maybe just in part to redeem myself from the discipline bashing that I've been doing today about geography. So Polito's a geographer. And she implies in this paper about the insidious and still very present specter of white supremacy that lies at the root of environmental racism that we all need to shift to target. And I'll stop there.